I remember that morning as though the fog had draped itself not only over Summertown streets, but also over my own mind. Oxford had a peculiar way of turning even the most familiar corners into something slightly alien when the mist was thick enough, and the early hour lent a stillness that invited reflection. I had walked past the closed gates of the college, noting the way the dew clung to the wrought iron, turning every curve into a ghostly ornament. A poet stood by the bridge, voice low, reciting fragments I could barely hear, the cadence like water over stone, and I wondered if he was aware of his audience, or whether his words were merely for the damp morning air. The news of Professor Hadley's disappearance reached me in the quietest fashion imaginable, a folded newspaper left atop a bench, its headline modest, almost apologetic. There was no screaming announcement, no scandal, only a few lines tucked between the business reports and the crossword. Yet something about the economy of words struck me. A death so easily consigned to obscurity made it all the more insistent to a mind tuned to nuance. The blue book, it seemed, had been left behind on his desk, a repository of forgotten details, obscure grievances, and notes written in a hand precise enough to betray both intellect and obsession. As I walked, I noticed the subtle dissonances that made Summertown a place of quiet curiosities. A bicycle leaning slightly askew against a lamp-post, the shadow of a hawthorn bent in the fog, a window left ajar where it ought to have been closed. There was a rhythm to the town, one that pulsed just beneath the surface, and it was precisely this rhythm I had learned to follow. The smallest deviation was often more telling than the most dramatic revelation. I paused to observe a letter pinned under a stone by the bridge, its envelope dampened by the mist. The handwriting was meticulous, deliberate, and yet there was a tremor, almost imperceptible, in the slant of the letters. I made a note to myself I did this often, even when alone, recording the subtle gestures that might later illuminate a hidden truth. The poet's voice had ceased, leaving only the quiet splash of the river and the occasional footstep echoing on stone. It struck me that even the absence of sound could be a kind of message. Returning toward the college, I noted the way the fog turned familiar facades into silhouettes, each building hinting at secrets, each courtyard a stage for unspoken interactions. The blue book, I sensed, would be a doorway, not merely into Hadley's academic world, but into the frailties and contradictions that haunted every scholar. I had learned long ago that the human heart often left its footprints in the margins of books, the pauses in conversation, the fleeting hesitation before a handshake. Perhaps that morning, I thought, was one such moment, pregnant with detail, waiting to be understood. By the time I reached my office, the mist had begun to lift slightly, revealing the first glimmers of sun upon Summertown's rooftops. Yet the fog persisted in memory, lingering over my thoughts. Even in daylight, certain questions remained suspended, and I had the quiet conviction that Professor Hadley's disappearance would demand more than a casual inquiry. Something subtle had shifted in the town, a whisper beneath the ordinary, a trace only perceptible to those who moved slowly enough to notice. I first became aware that Professor Hadley had truly vanished when the porters mentioned it in passing, as though it were a minor inconvenience, rather than the absence of a man who had shaped the minds of generations. His rooms in the college were neat to the point of severity, the polished brass handles gleaming under the lamplight, and yet there was an air of incompleteness, a subtle disorder in the arrangement of books and papers that suggested he had left in haste or been interrupted. I noted the placement of his spectacles on the edge of the desk, the open page of a ledger, a quill still poised above blotting paper. None of these seemed extraordinary on their own, yet together they formed a quiet puzzle. I questioned his colleagues in the common room, where the smell of tea mingled with the must of ancient oak. They spoke in measured tones, each phrase deliberate, as though testing the propriety of their own statements. One mentioned a disagreement over departmental matters, another hinted at an old rivalry with the literature faculty. Their gestures were controlled, yet I observed a subtle twitch of a finger when mentioning Hadley's last lecture, and a brief hesitation before they named the Blue Book. Such small disruptions of composure often betrayed more than words could convey. The librarian, a thin man with spectacles perched precariously, recalled Hadley entering the archives with a particular intensity, tracing his fingers along the spines of rare volumes. His voice was quiet, almost conspiratorial, as though he feared being overheard, yet he left out details, small omissions that spoke volumes. I remembered a misaligned footnote I had glimpsed the day before in a manuscript, and suddenly it seemed connected to an overlooked reference to a scholarship Hadley had applied for, long denied, now returning to shadow his disappearance. The town itself appeared unaltered, indifferent to the absence. Morning traffic moved with habitual purpose, and shopkeepers arranged their wares as if no change had occurred. Yet the air was subtly different, heavier in certain streets, as if Hadley's absence had left a void that was perceptible to a careful observer. I walked past the post office, noting letters with curled corners, the scribbled annotations on their fronts, and I wondered whether the careful indexing of such minor details would reveal something larger if only followed to its end. In a corridor of the college, I noticed a slipper left near the lecture hall turned slightly as though in mid-step, and the impression it left in the dust suggested a sudden halt. I remembered the Blue Book once more, the cryptic notes in its margins, and I imagined Hadley seated with that meticulous care he brought to scholarship, writing annotations meant only for himself, each line a coded reflection of grievances, regrets, and unresolved ambitions. The porter mentioned the last sighting, Hadley, leaving for a routine errand in Summertown, umbrella in hand, despite the uncertain drizzle. Yet no one seemed to recall his return. It was the absence itself, the subtle collapse of expectation, that commanded attention. In observing these fragments, the slight hesitation, the mislaid item, the incomplete ledger, I began to sense the first threads of a pattern, fragile, almost imperceptible, waiting for a mind patient enough to assemble them. And I knew, as I walked once more through the dampened streets, that the quiet city would conceal its truths as long as I allowed it to, revealing them only to those who could read the silence between words. The Blue Book sat on Hadley's desk like a reliquary, its worn cover, a deep, almost imperceptible shade of azure, corners softened by repeated handling. I remember lifting it carefully, sensing the weight not just of paper, but of unspoken histories pressed between its pages. It contained the college registers, meticulously maintained, but also something more, a series of annotations in Hadley's unmistakable hand, small, deliberate marks that suggested an order known only to him. I traced a finger along the margin, noticing a subtle deviation in ink, a hesitation in the stroke, as though each note bore a hidden hesitation or grievance that had not survived ordinary observation. Opening the book, I found more than mere records. Dates and names appeared normal at first glance, yet the repetition of certain initials, the careful alignment of certain entries, hinted at a coded narrative. There was a faint, chemical smell of ink, mixed with the persistent aroma of dust from the centuries-old oak shelves surrounding the office, a reminder that knowledge here carried weight as well as fragility. I made a note of a tiny smudge on a page, barely perceptible, which suggested Hadley had corrected something, perhaps deliberately, in the margin, leaving a trace of intent more telling than the text itself. One line drew my attention to a reference to a summer seminar with a single word, underlined 3 times, eclipse. Its relevance was obscure, yet its repetition suggested significance beyond the ordinary, the kind of minor anomaly that once observed cannot be ignored. I considered that Hadley, with his habitual attention to order and symmetry, would not have highlighted it casually. Something lay beneath it, obscured but deliberate, and my instincts urged patience. I filed it away, mentally bookmarking it for later reflection. The book revealed other subtleties as I examined the marginalia. Tiny discrepancies in dates, and names spelled slightly differently across successive entries, hints of conversations that might never have occurred openly. It was a map of relationships, of grudges, alliances, and overlooked debts. I paused to observe a small flourish in Hadley's handwriting, an almost imperceptible curl at the end of a signature that seemed at once elegant and mocking. I imagined him seated here, tracing these lines with purpose, the quiet tension of his intellect suspended between the weight of expectation and the caprice of human error. I took note of the blue book's positioning on the desk, slightly askew, as if moved hastily. The open ledger beneath it bore a small circular indentation, the residue of a paperweight perhaps, yet the alignment suggested a pattern, a deliberate concealment or revelation meant for attentive eyes. These minor details, the tilt of a book, the pressure of ink, the faint scent of old pages, spoke to a mind attuned to subtleties, to the unspoken language of intent and omission. Closing the blue book, I felt its significance settle in the quiet room, a repository not only of records but of human frailty and obsession. The day outside had begun to brighten, but inside this office, time seemed suspended. Each annotation, each deliberate smudge, each underlined word whispered of past conflicts and secret designs. I realized then that the book was more than a record. It was a guide into the tangled interior of Hadley's life, and perhaps the labyrinth through which the truth of his disappearance would eventually be traced. The Bodleian seemed to hold its breath that afternoon, the light diffused through tall, mullioned windows, casting long, uncertain shadows across rows of ancient volumes. I moved slowly between the stacks, noting the scent of vellum and dust, the faint tang of old leather that made one feel simultaneously alive and diminished. Hadley had spent countless hours here, tracing the histories of men long departed, and it occurred to me that in a place so devoted to preservation, one could also conceal the smallest subversions of truth. I was aware of every creak of the floorboards beneath my shoes, the whisper of pages turned in a distant alcove, the slight sigh of the heating system struggling against the chill. These were the sounds of observation, the unspoken markers that often preceded discovery. I examined a manuscript Hadley had referenced repeatedly. A marginal note caught my eye, an altered quote, a misattribution of Byron, something so subtle it could be dismissed by anyone less attentive. Yet the irregularity struck me as intentional, a signal perhaps, or the echo of a private grievance. It was this insistence on detail, the almost obsessive attention to nuance that suggested to me a mind both brilliant and dangerously brittle. I traced my finger along the corrected passage, the faint indentations in the paper revealing the rhythm of Hadley's hand as he wrote, erased, and revised, leaving behind each small history of uncertainty. A librarian appeared, thin-shouldered and guarded, eyes darting between the stacks and me, as if weighing my intentions. He mentioned Hadley's inquiries into an obscure college scandal, a matter long thought settled, yet he was careful to omit the particulars. I observed his posture, the slight tremor in a hand as he reached for a volume of correspondence, and I made a mental note. The omission, the hesitation, were themselves clues. Outside the library the rain fell quietly against stone, a persistent drumming that seemed to mirror my own measured pulse. Among the manuscripts I discovered a folded slip of paper, almost invisible, tucked into a volume on classical rhetoric. The note contained a single line referencing a seminar and a name altered slightly from the official record. It was the kind of subtle inconsistency that might escape ordinary notice but, once seen, illuminates entire corridors of intent. I considered that Hadley, meticulous and deliberate, would have noticed it immediately, perhaps leaving a mark of recognition in his own marginalia, and this connection tugged at a loose thread I could not yet follow to its end. As I moved toward the reading room, the play of shadow and light created ephemeral patterns on the stone floor. I noticed a small scratch along the edge of a chair, barely visible, the kind of mark a hurried hand might leave without thought. It seemed trivial, and yet, when combined with the other minor irregularities, the altered quote, the mislaid slip, the librarian's hesitation became part of a delicate lattice of evidence, an invitation to see beyond the apparent calm of the library into the quietly turbulent world Hadley navigated. I left the Bodleian that evening with more questions than answers. The blue of the fading sky mirrored in the spine of the manuscript I carried in my mind. Shadows lingered even as daylight dimmed, and I sensed that the library, guardian of centuries of knowledge, held secrets that would only emerge through patience, attention, and the willingness to read the small tremors hidden in ordinary life. Somewhere in those whispers of ink and dust, Hadley's presence still spoke, and I knew I had only begun to hear it. I first noticed it while idly scanning the crossword in the Oxford Times, a habit I had cultivated to occupy the intervals between observation and thought. The word eclipse was circled in ink, the loop of the pen uneven, almost hesitant, as though whoever marked it had been interrupted mid-gesture. At first I dismissed its stray annotation, a crossword enthusiast's peculiar emphasis, but the insistence of its repetition, appearing in a subsequent puzzle the very next day, drew my attention. Such minor anomalies, I had learned, were seldom accidental. They invited a patient observer to look beneath the apparent triviality. Later in the college courtyard, I reflected on the blue book again, the underlined passages and marginalia that hinted at rivalries and grudges. The repetition of eclipse now seemed less coincidental. Hadley had been methodical, leaving traces for the attentive eye, little markers to illuminate the path through the obscured corridors of his life. It occurred to me that the circled word might function in the same manner, a subtle signal threaded through ordinary pages, visible only to someone willing to consider the extraordinary embedded in the mundane. I returned to the lecture hall where Hadley had last been seen. The oak floorboards creaked underfoot, the faint smell of chalk lingering from forgotten lectures. A chair was slightly misaligned, its legs tracing a small angle that suggested haste rather than casual displacement. I crouched and examined the scuff marks on the polished wood, noticing a small fleck of blue ink that mirrored the hue of the blue book. It was trivial, yet in combination with the circled crossword word, it suggested the continuity of intent, a deliberate trail that bridged Hadley's intellectual space and the broader world outside the college. A student passed in the corridor, eyes downcast, footsteps hesitant. I observed the tilt of his head, the nervous adjustment of a sleeve, subtle signs of consciousness or perhaps conscience being tested. There was a pattern here, faint and easily overlooked, gestures, omissions, the cadence of speech, each as informative as any explicit statement. In a margin of a borrowed text, I noticed a tiny annotation, almost erased, noting a disagreement over an interpretation of classical poetry. Again, the recurrence of certain initials struck me. Hadley's habitual emphasis on repetition, the deliberate echoing of names and events, the evidence of small things was mounting. Back in the office, I considered the significance of signals, both explicit and implicit. A telephone call from Lewis had interrupted my reverie, a mundane question regarding library requests, yet I imagined the cadence of his words and the timing of the interruption could reveal more than intended. The blue book, the crossword, the misaligned chair, the trace of in-call of these were converging in a quiet rhythm, the kind of pattern that required patience, reflection, and the willingness to see connections in shadows. I closed the Oxford Times, letting the paper rest against my forearm, the faint aroma of ink mingling with the lingering chill in the room. The word eclipse remained, small yet insistent, a cryptic marker whose full significance had yet to reveal itself. I realized that each minor detail, the hesitation in a pen stroke, a subtle misalignment, the echo of a repeated phrase was part of a tapestry far larger than any single observation. The investigation, like the morning light diffused through Summertown's mist, required time to clarify, yet already its patterns were beginning to shimmer, faint and elusive beneath the ordinary surface of things. I arrived at the college tea room mid-afternoon, the scent of brewing tea and fresh scones mingling with the faint tang of aged wood and dust from high shelves. The room was quiet, the usual murmur of conversation subdued, as though the disappearance of Professor Hadley had unsettled the very air. I seated myself at a corner table, observing the subtle movements of the staff, the careful placement of teacups and sugar tongs, and the way a napkin was smoothed once, twice, before being set aside. It was here that one could detect the unspoken anxieties of a small academic world, a place where gestures often betrayed what words tried to conceal. The manager, a woman of measured politeness and watchful eyes, approached with a tray. She spoke in a low tone about Hadley's habits, recalling in passing a conversation she had overheard days before a discussion between him and a visitor whose identity remained unnamed. The phrasing was peculiar, the emphasis on certain words slightly off, as though rehearsed. I listened carefully, noting her pauses, the subtle hesitation before she mentioned the blue book, and the almost imperceptible tightening of her hands around the tray. These gestures, minor in isolation, suggested something withheld, and I committed them to memory. I recalled the blue book's annotated entries, the small underlined words and marginalia that hinted at private disputes and unacknowledged grievances. Perhaps the conversation the manager overheard had referenced one of these disputes, an argument that had passed unnoticed by others, but lingered in a space of silence. The words she repeated, imperfectly recalled, were fragments, yet they aligned with details I had seen before: a misquoted line of poetry, a crossed word in a newspaper, a footnote adjusted in haste. Each was a small thread, delicate but telling, weaving toward a pattern I could not yet fully discern. As she poured tea, I noticed the tilt of her head when she mentioned a certain seminar, the brief glance toward a shelf where the registers were kept, and the way her voice faltered ever so slightly. It was not alarm or fear, but an acknowledgement of awareness, the quiet recognition that she knew more than she revealed. In that gesture, in the weight of unspoken words, lay a clue perhaps as significant as any explicit statement. Hadley's world, it seemed, extended beyond his lectures and manuscripts into the shadows of ordinary spaces where one least expected scrutiny. I left the tea room with a sense of the invisible, the persistent impression that the ordinary routines of daily life were punctuated with hidden meaning. Even the simplest act, pouring a cup of tea, arranging a tray, repeating a conversation, could contain a trace of truth, the echo of a clandestine moment. Outside, the drizzle had softened to a mist, the cobbled streets reflecting the muted light of overcast skies. It struck me that Hadley's absence had begun to reveal itself in these subtle confessions, in the gestures and silences that were as instructive as any formal evidence. Walking away, I considered the rhythm of observation, noticing a hesitation, a glance, a misremembered phrase, and understanding that it was precisely these small, fragile indicators that often contained the heart of a mystery. The tea room had spoken in whispers, in pauses, in movements easily overlooked, yet I felt that it had provided a fragment of illumination, a faint flicker toward the larger truth. And I knew that each such fragment would need careful tending if the full pattern of Hadley's disappearance were ever to emerge. The streets of Summertown carried a peculiar stillness that afternoon, the drizzle softening the outlines of shop fronts and dampening the usual clatter of bicycles and footsteps. I walked slowly, noting the way reflections blurred in puddles, each distorted image suggesting a world slightly askew, familiar, yet not entirely so. The absence of Hadley seemed to manifest in the subtle unevenness of the town, a gap between expectation and reality that could be felt more than measured. It was in these quiet dislocations that one often found the first threads of a larger pattern, imperceptible to casual observers, yet insistent to those willing to linger. I traced Hadley's last known route, observing the small details that most would overlook. A register of a local inn showed a room booked briefly under a variant of his name, a footnote in the ledger, noting a payment in exact change. The clerk spoke with practiced neutrality, yet the tilt of his head and the flicker of his eyes betrayed the effort to maintain propriety while suppressing recollection. Minor as it seemed, the misalignment between ledger and memory was a subtle thread, suggesting that the ordinary movements of life could conceal anomalies that only a patient observer might perceive. Passing a quiet alley, I noticed the impression of a shoe in the mud, angled slightly as if the wearer had paused abruptly. The mark was almost erased by a subsequent drizzle, yet it lingered enough to suggest haste or surprise. I considered the sequence of events, the mislaid ledger, the circled word in a newspaper crossword, the misaligned footstep, and the recurring initials in the blue book, and I felt a faint pattern emerging, fragile but insistently coherent. Hadley's disappearance was not merely a matter of absent presence, it was woven into the smallest interruptions of routine, the unspoken tremors that signaled deviation. A distant figure, partially obscured by the mist, caught my attention, a passer-by whose coat moved with a deliberateness that seemed out of sync with the casual rhythm of the street. I noted the angle of the collar, the tilt of the head, and the subtle adjustment of gloves. Nothing conclusive, yet a gesture that demanded record, stored as a faint possibility against the broader context of absence and intention. Often these minutiae would prove decisive long before overt evidence revealed itself. Reaching a small bridge, I paused, letting the town settle around me. The murmur of water beneath the arches, the muted glint of light on wet stone, the distant toll of a bell, all contributed to a rhythm that mirrored the oscillation of thought. Each observation, however minor a glance, a gesture, an anomaly in a ledger, was a note in a silent symphony, and I sensed that Hadley's trail had been traced not through dramatic revelation, but through the careful alignment of these understated signals. By the time I returned toward the college, the mist had begun to lift slightly, revealing the outlines of familiar rooftops, yet the subtle sense of displacement persisted. Shadows of ordinary objects and ordinary people seemed to carry extra meaning, and I understood that the investigation required attentiveness not merely to events, but to the spaces between them. Summertown itself, quiet and indifferent on the surface, harbored the faint tremors of intention, the barely perceptible shifts that indicated that Hadley's disappearance was a deliberate punctuation in a town otherwise composed of habitual continuity. I had been turning over the same details for days, the subtle gestures, the crossed words, the anomalies in registers and marginalia, when a particular lead began to unravel under its own weight. One of Hadley's colleagues, whose name had surfaced repeatedly, in conversations and obscure references seemed initially to fit the pattern of culpability with remarkable precision. Yet the closer I examined the ledger entries, the annotations in the Blue Book, and the scattered slips of paper in the library, the more I began to sense that the evidence had been curated, consciously or unconsciously, to suggest guilt when none existed. It was in the quiet of my office, the fading light slanting through half-drawn curtains, that the incongruity first became evident. A comparison of handwriting revealed a subtle inconsistency, an over-emphasized flourish here, a hesitation there, the kind of variance that could escape casual attention but spoke volumes to anyone attuned to patterns. I realized that the colleague's apparent anxiety, the seemingly nervous gestures, had been amplified by the circumstances rather than originating from malice. The guilt had been inferred by others, not necessarily assumed by the individual themselves. I reviewed the library notes once more, tracing the faint pencil marks that Hadley had made in a manuscript. The emphasis on certain names, previously interpreted as veiled threats, now appeared more as scholarly insistence, annotations born of intellectual curiosity rather than personal animus. A misaligned page and a repeated reference to a seminar titled Eclipse emerged as consistent markers of attention, yet unrelated to the colleague in question. The misdirection was subtle, a shadow cast by coincidence and scholarly obsession, and it required careful untangling to see clearly. A brief consultation with Lewis confirmed a detail I had overlooked. The timeline of the colleague's movements was impeccable, corroborated by several independent witnesses and cross-referenced against the Blue Book's entries. The apparent discrepancies were either clerical or coincidental, forming a pattern that looked culpable only because the human mind favors narrative over randomness. In realizing this, I felt a quiet, almost melancholy satisfaction, the recognition that the first perceived solution had been a distraction, a minor tempest in the otherwise methodical progression of observation. The exercise reminded me how easily one could be misled by patterns that were compelling but ultimately irrelevant, how the mind constructs causality where only proximity exists. The colleague, though anxious and meticulous in manner, was not implicated by intent or action, and the red herring lay exposed not in an overt confession or error, but in the accumulation of seemingly meaningful signals. Each gesture, each annotation, each misaligned ledger entry had been a strand of illusion, waiting to be disentangled by careful attention. Even as the red herring was laid aside, the investigation deepened, the threads of true significance sharpening in contrast. Minor observations, an underlined word, a hesitated glance, a corrected footnote had not been wasted but redirected, refocusing attention on the spaces between appearances and reality. Hadley's absence remained enigmatic, yet the pattern of misdirection provided both caution and clarity. The ordinary could conceal the extraordinary, the intentional could mimic the accidental, and one must always allow the subtleties to breathe, unhurried, unpressured, before claiming comprehension. It was in the quiet corner of the college archives that I found the fragment, a torn page, edges uneven and discoloured, pressed between the leaves of a 17th-century manuscript. The page carried Hadley's familiar hand, meticulous yet hesitant in places, and the words formed a line of verse, obscure, almost cryptic. I held it gently, aware that a single page could carry the weight of years, a trace of memory, a fragment of intention that had survived time and neglect. The faint aroma of old paper, mixed with the lingering scent of ink, filled the narrow space between shelves, and I felt the pulse of history pressing subtly against the present. As I read, I noticed a slight indentation beneath one line, a subtle pressure left by a previous hand, confirmation that the note had been handled carefully, repeatedly, as if it carried a secret meant only for certain eyes. The verse referenced a seminar and a name that at first glance seemed inconsequential, but the repetition, paired with an unusual emphasis in Hadley's annotations, suggested something more. The fragment was not merely literary, it was a key to a network of connections, a single hinge upon which the larger door of understanding might swing. I recalled the blue book, the ledger entries, the circled word in the crossword eclipse, and the misaligned chair in the lecture hall. Each of these details had been a whisper, a suggestion rather than a statement, and now the fragment illuminated them, refracting the familiar through the prism of new understanding. The emphasis on certain initials, the subtle alteration of a date, the faintly underlined word all converged here, revealing that Hadley's disappearance was intertwined with events and intentions long obscured, a narrative patiently encoded for careful observation. The librarian had watched me, expression measured, perhaps aware that I had stumbled upon something not immediately obvious. I noticed a flicker in his eye when I mentioned the seminar, a hesitation in the turn of a page, and I understood that the fragment resonated beyond its textual content, touching nerves both past and present. Even in small absences, the missing line of a letter, the erased margin became amplified, acquiring meaning in the context of this recovered page. In Oxford, as elsewhere, the weight of memory often rested in details easily overlooked. I traced the handwriting, observing the loops and curls, the deliberate spacing that suggested emphasis, the slight tremor in a letter that betrayed emotion beneath intellect. It was the same hand that had made notes in the blue book, the same mind that had circled the word in the crossword, and I realized with a quiet satisfaction that the seemingly isolated minutiae were threads of a single design. Hadley had left them as subtle markers, delicate signposts for anyone willing to trace them, and the fragment of verse now acted as a focal point, clarifying connections previously perceived only in shadow. Returning the page carefully to its resting place, I felt the weight of the past settle alongside the present. The fragment, ephemeral and delicate, had revealed a lattice of intent, a concealed pattern emerging from decades of habit, rivalry, and subtle grievance. The hidden architecture of Hadley's academic and personal life began to cohere in my mind, the minor gestures and overlooked details gaining clarity. And yet even with this illumination the truth remained partial, shadowed by human complexity, leaving a quiet ache of possibility, the sense that much remained unseen and waiting, just beyond the reach of immediate comprehension. The college courtyard had taken on a quiet, almost theatrical stillness as I arrived, the stone flags slick with drizzle and the mist curling around the arches like a hesitant audience. I was met by the remaining suspects, each summoned with care, their expressions controlled, but revealing the slightest tremor when confronted by expectation. It is remarkable how even the most composed individuals betray themselves in minute gestures, a shifted weight, a fleeting glance, the curling of a hand around a book. These were the subtleties I sought, the quiet markers that might illuminate intentions otherwise masked. I began with casual observation, noting the alignment of their footsteps as they approached, the rhythm of breathing, the faint scent of rain on tweed mingled with soap and dust. One of the scholars, ostensibly composed, avoided the line of my gaze and tucked a handkerchief into the pocket of his coat with an unnecessary precision. Another lingered by the stone bench, brushing a stray leaf from his notes with exaggerated care, as if the action itself could conceal something deeper. Such minor displacements often carry more significance than any overt statement. The ordinary gestures of civility can betray the extraordinary truths beneath. Questions were posed gently, indirectly, framed as matters of curiosity rather than accusation. I inquired about seminars, recent correspondence in and the seemingly innocuous movements of Hadley in the days before his disappearance. The responses were measured, often rehearsed, yet I noted hesitation, a brief faltering in syntax, a misquote from a classical author. These slight deviations, the wrong emphasis, a subtle misalignment in memory, were signals, delicate and almost imperceptible, that suggested areas of concealment. My attention returned repeatedly to the blue book, the annotations, the faintly circled word in the newspaper, each an echo of prior observations now resonating with renewed clarity. I observed a gesture repeated across different individuals, a tilt of the head when a name was mentioned, a hand hovering for an instant over a notebook, a glance that shifted too rapidly. The coordination of these minor signals, previously interpreted as coincidence, began to suggest a network of intention, a silent choreography of concealment and disclosure. Yet none of it sufficed in isolation. Only in conjunction with the details I had meticulously recorded, over days did the tableau begin to resolve. As the questioning proceeded, a misaligned ledger, a partially erased note, and a faint ink smudge on a manuscript collectively pointed to a resolution, though still incomplete. I could perceive, without articulating fully, the intersection of motives, pride, rivalry, and personal grievance layered beneath the professional facades of civility. The atmosphere, thick with unspoken tension and the damp scent of rain on stone, seemed to amplify every minute hesitation, every whispered denial, until the truth hovered just beyond overt articulation. By the time the meeting drew to a close, the courtyard remained still, yet charged with the invisible energy of revelation and anticipation. Each participant departed with a careful neutrality, unaware of the intricate lattice of observation that had been silently constructed around them. I remained alone, sensing that the final strands of understanding were nearly in place, awaiting only the subtle illumination that would transform disparate gestures, annotations and hesitations into the coherent pattern that Hadley's disappearance demanded. The final hours of the investigation settled over Summertown like a gentle fog, softening edges yet sharpening observation. I walked the quiet streets, the damp cobblestones reflecting the muted light, and considered the paths by which Hadley's disappearance had been revealed. Each minor detail, previously noted and often doubted, now seemed to coalesce: the blue book annotations, the circled word in the newspaper, the slight tremor in a colleague's hand, the erased margin of a manuscript had spoken to a truth that was as much about human frailty as academic ambition. I revisited the college courtyard, empty now, save for the wind drifting through the arches, carrying the faint scent of rain and limestone. The atmosphere was transformed by absence, the ordinary bustle of scholars replaced with a contemplative silence that invited reflection. It struck me that the investigation had not merely uncovered a chain of events, but had illuminated character, revealing pride, resentment, and subtle loyalties that had previously gone unnoticed. In this, the disappearance was a prism through which the human condition was refracted, showing its flaws and its occasional grace in the smallest gestures and omissions. I considered the colleagues whose names had surfaced repeatedly, their expressions calm now, relieved, yet tinged with an unspoken awareness. Pride and reputation had dictated the careful measures of their replies, yet there remained an undercurrent of vulnerability, the recognition that intellect does not immunize one against error or misjudgment. Even the red herring exposed in the preceding hours served as a lesson in perception, the reminder that appearance often masks motive, and that a careful eye must discern the signal from the noise. The blue book rested on Hadley's desk, closed now, its weight both literal and symbolic. Each annotation, each underlined word, each hesitant flourish had guided the investigation as subtly as a whisper, confirming that what is most significant is rarely proclaimed with overt drama. It occurred to me that Hadley had anticipated scrutiny, leaving traces that would only speak to those patients enough to observe with care. There was a certain elegance in this method, a restrained poetry that matched the temperament of a man devoted to scholarship and conscious of the fragility of human networks. I paused by the library steps, noting the faint reflections in the wet stone, the way shadows lingered longer than expected, and the soft echo of a distant footstep. I thought of the fragment from the archives, the overlooked verse that had clarified hidden connections, and I understood that resolution is often a matter of alignment, gestures, notes, and inconsistencies coalescing into coherence once one perceives the pattern. Yet even as clarity emerged, a quiet melancholy remained, the recognition that knowledge does not restore what was lost, and that comprehension often arrives accompanied by a subtle ache of reflection. Returning to my office, I allowed the quiet to settle, noting the lingering scent of paper and rain. Lewis's occasional query, the muted footsteps along the corridor, the subdued patter of rainfall outside the ordinary rhythms of college life, resumed, subtly altered by absence and revelation. I thought of Hadley, of the careful threads he had woven, and of the human imperfections that had complicated his disappearance. There was satisfaction in understanding, tempered by the lingering recognition that not all questions were answered, and that some shadows remain even after the pattern is discerned. The investigation had reached its resolution, yet in the quiet that followed, reflection held its own quiet authority, leaving the heart contemplative and the mind attentive to the faintest signals of what might yet remain. The evening settled over Summertown with a quiet inevitability, a lingering hush that blurred the edges of familiar rooftops and the narrow lanes that twisted between them. I walked alone, the rain having ceased, but the cobblestones still slick, reflecting the dim glow of street lamps like distant, trembling stars. It was the kind of hour in which memory and observation intertwine, when the residue of past events lingers just beneath the surface of the present. The disappearance of Hadley, the traces of the Blue Book, the subtle gestures and misaligned annotations, all coalesced in the mind like faint echoes in a cathedral, reverberating long after the last note had sounded. Passing the library, I noticed the faint tilt of a window left ajar, a shadow cast against the interior that seemed momentarily animate, as if the building itself were conscious of what had transpired within. I remembered the fragment from the archives, the cryptic verse, the underlined words and hesitant flourishes, and I understood that even after resolution, subtle traces remain, like a footprint pressed into soft mud, imperceptible, yet indelible. The town had returned to its outward calm, yet the quiet pulse of unease lingered, a silent testament to the complexities of human design. I recalled the gestures observed in the courtyard, the fleeting misalignments in registers, the circled word in a newspaper crossword. Individually, they might have seemed inconsequential, but taken together, they formed a lattice of meaning, a delicate architecture of intent and concealment. Hadley's absence had revealed itself not through dramatic declarations, but through these faint, almost imperceptible signals, and it was precisely this subtlety that rendered the resolution both complete and incomplete, satisfying and haunting simultaneously. The footsteps behind me echoed lightly, almost in rhythm with my own, yet when I glanced back there was no one, only the suggestion of presence, a trick of reflection and shadow. I remembered the colleagues, the librarian, the tea-room manager, each leaving faint imprints of hesitation, glances and careful phrasing. These minor tremors of consciousness, once assembled, revealed motives and anxieties that were otherwise invisible. Even now, the memory of those interactions carried weight, a whisper of the human frailty that underpinned scholarly precision. By the river, the water ran quietly, reflecting the waning light and the silhouettes of the bridge above. I paused, thinking of the blue book resting on Hadley's desk, closed, yet brimming with the traces of intention. Knowledge, I realized, often leaves its echoes in the spaces between words, in the gestures that are easily overlooked, and in the subtle irregularities that only the patient observer perceives. The mind must trace these fragments carefully as a musician following the reverberation of a chord into silence, understanding that meaning lingers in absence as much as in presence. As I made my way back to the college, the mist rising faintly from the damp streets, I felt the quiet ache of comprehension, the melancholy satisfaction that accompanies understanding tempered by the recognition of mystery, yet unresolved. The town slept, the lamps glimmered, and the echoes of the vanished professor whispered through the architecture of Summertown, leaving behind patterns, signs, and the haunting suggestion that even in conclusion, some truths are perpetually elusive, awaiting only the attentiveness of an eye trained to see the faintest trace of intention in the ordinary world.